Professor Anup Kumar for this, and also Dr. Purohit. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for highlighting the importance of Ahimsa in modern time. In fact, Mahatma Gandhi was the one who popularized this old Indian saying that Ahimsa is Ahimsa Param Dharma. So, yeah, Param Dharma. With this, I want to inform you all of you that this lecture we are broadcasting this lecture on Facebook as a live broadcasting. So I request all the participants on this platform and on Facebook, if they have any question with our speaker, they can put those questions in chat box. I also want to welcome our guest from America, Professor Richard M. Perloff, Professor Cliff Anthony. Welcome you all, sir.
Okay, but you never told me that some more professors have joined. So I have said a word of welcome to them also.
We just saw them on our screen.
So from the HNB Garhwal University also, we extend a very warm welcome to all the professors who have joined from the US.
Yes.
Hearty welcome to all of you. Now you go ahead, please.
Now I would like to introduce our speaker, Professor Anup Kumar. Professor Anup Kumar is a professor at Cleveland State University. His research focuses on interaction among media, populist politics, political movement. He has conducted research on subnational populist movement in India, populist politics in US, and Egyptian political popular upspring of 2011 to 2013. He has published research articles in various peer-reviewed journals, including Journal of Communication, Inquiry, Journal of Broadcasting, Electronic Media, International Journal of Press and Politics, Newspaper Research Journal of Media, and many more. He has authored The Making of Small States, Populist Social Movement, and the Hindi Press in Uttarakhand Movement 2011. He has received many awards, and he was a fellow at Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla, in summer 2014. With this very brief introduction, I would like to invite you, sir, to deliver your lecture. Over to you, Professor Anup Kumar.
Thank you, everyone, for being here in this remote setting. But before that, I start my lecture, I'd like to express my condolences for the passing of President Pranab Mukherjee. I had the privilege of meeting him many times, and one of my encounters with him started with on a reporting assignment when he was visiting Dehradun at Indian Institute of Petroleum. It was a very fascinating episode in politics where a person from southern India had claimed that he was able to make petrol from plants. And it turned into a big hue and cry that there is discrimination against people from Tamil Nadu and their talent is not being recognized. And Pranab Mukherjee intervened. It became really a massive issue, which everybody was surprised by it. And then Pranab Mukherjee came to Indian Institute of Petroleum and told them to conduct a test on his methods and see whether it works or not. And I had a very long chat with him when he was there. It was instructive how well read he was and how sophisticated his understanding of Indian politics was. But so we'll miss him surely. Moving on, let me thank you, Professor Annapurna Nautiyal, for Professor Prashant Kandari and Professor D.R. Purohit for this invitation. It is indeed a privilege to speak on the 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. I know we academics don't like to give lectures through these remote settings because often we feed from the audience the feedback you get in a room. And the irony is this, that should not be lost, that Mahatma Gandhi, who himself very gregarious person, very people's person. He was always surrounded by people. His lecture on him is to be given in this kind of a virtual setting. But this is the time we are in. And maybe future is also going to be more remote, like the way things are looking, at least for a few years now. Well, Corona is not going anywhere for a couple of years, it seems. So my remarks today will be about Mahatma Gandhi, whose actual name was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. I'm not going to speak primarily his role in the India's freedom struggle, which is very well understood and everybody in India knows it. They read in school textbooks and everybody knows the leadership role he played in the national movement, the tragic death that he was assassinated at the end, just a few months after India's independence. So that is a story well known. And as academics, as scholars, I'm more interested in thinking about Mahatma Gandhi as a political theorist. And it is very rarely we actually focus on Gandhi as a political theorist. We think of Gandhi either as a political leader or Gandhi as a saint. And those two things are true. But Gandhi did a lot of writing. He was, his works are published in tens of volumes. It's a lot of writing. He was also a journalist, editor of a newspaper. He used to write a lot. And in his writing, you see a lot of reflexive thinking. He was a very self-critical person. He was always thinking about his own actions. And this is one of the interesting things about Gandhi is this, that lot of critique of Gandhi that we see, whether coming from the right of the political spectrum or the left of the political spectrum, relies on everything that Gandhi has said himself. So it's not like nobody critiques Gandhi saying, hey, I've discovered something about Gandhi you might not know, because Gandhi has told about himself everything. And so he was a very fascinating figure from that point of view. It's almost like, George Bernard Shaw in a classic essay, All Autobiographies Are Lies, said that nobody's bad enough to tell everything about himself. But Gandhi was that bad person to tell everything about himself. And that was the transparency he had. So we already know all that. But I, as a scholar of political communication, of media and politics, journalism, I'm more interested in that we need to rediscover the Gandhi, the scholar, the Gandhi, the theorist. And that is something, a work which I've been working on for some time. I've been thinking that we should be thinking about Gandhi from that perspective, because that is his relevance globally outside India's freedom struggle is primarily from how he theorized politics. And the interesting thing about Gandhi was this, that his theorization of politics was not just interpretive. It had a very social scientific basis. He developed concepts and then he put them in practice and then he experimented with them. So it's like a classic social science where you have ideas and you test those ideas in actual real world. And so that makes it very interesting that we haven't really focused so much on Gandhi as a scholar. It's not only Gandhi, we don't really focus too much on other leaders as well. Around the world, there are a lot of politicians who are also scholars and who have theorized politics. In India, we have Baba Sahib Ambedkar, who was a great theorist of social justice and institutional democracy. Differences on the way social justice could be achieved, and also he was as I said, he was an institutionalist. He believed in the parliamentary process and the democratic institutions, and did not believe in social protest on the streets, which he described as grammar of anarchy. So it's interesting that you have this contrasting two views on how politics was to be conceptualized. Then we also have people like P.C. Joshi, who was from Uttarakhand, and M.N. Roy, who actually lived in Dehradun also for some time, and E.M.S. Namboodiripad from Kerala. These are politicians who were also theorists, and they were theorists of Marxism in the Indian context. We have K.P. Jaiswal, who many people have forgotten. He was a theorist of Hindu polity. And Ram Manohar Lohia, who had conceptualized socialism in an Indian context. He was an Indic socialist. You cannot compare him with a lot of other socialism. He had actually thought about it from the below, how socialism in India can survive. And so we should be, as scholars, I think, and this is I'm trying to put it in front before I talk about Gandhi, is this, that we should be, as scholars in universities and academic departments, should be thinking about these politicians, especially politicians who have written a lot, to focus on their writing and try to see how they had conceptualized politics. As you know, my talk is on global relevance of Gandhi and Ahimsa and theory of political action and social change. So to talk about that, we have to think about one thing which I'm going to focus on is politics as action. Action which is different from party politics, different from electoral politics, but it is day-to-day politics. And politics which is designed to transform society, to bring change, but also politics which is basically about negotiating who gets to wield power on behalf of the society and how power is distributed in society. And in the process of that distribution of power is there social justice. So that is the day-to-day politics that we see. Instead of, there's too much of focus on elections and party politics. Politics is everywhere. And this is from this perspective, I'm not trying to say that politics is, I'm trying to draw your attention to politics is not negative, okay? Politics is a very positive thing. Because that is how, as societies collectively, we can solve problems and agree to organize societies. So that is what Gandhi thought about. Gandhi's understanding of politics was much more fundamental. And that fundamental nature of politics had two essential components. One was that politics was speech. That means what you say, and how politics was practiced through speech. And also politics was practiced through the whole business of persuasion. So how do you persuade others? If you think your views are right, if you have a policy position, if you think that the issue you have picked up is right, how do you persuade others? Because the other alternative is this, that my view is right and I can force you to accept it. That would be coercive. You could use violence, you could use other coercive means to make somebody else realize that accept your views. But Gandhi was a very strong believer in the power of persuasion, that how you can persuade people and what you can do in the process of persuasion. So keep that in mind, the idea of persuasion. I want to delve a little bit more on that. And the other part of Gandhi's view was this, that why should social mass movement or a social struggle be brought onto the street? What is the objective here? And this is where his differences with Dr. Ambedkar came about, which is primarily that he knew that first thing, that if you think that your issue is right, if you think that the agenda on which you are engaging your politics is correct, you need to be in the public space. You need to occupy the public space and be heard and seen by people in the corridors of power. Now, in the process of being heard and seen in the corridor, you could not succeed. Maybe you organize a protest and nobody pays attention to it. You organize a sit-in, you organize a dharna, you organize a fast, you organize a rally, and nobody cares. And that is where the tension lies. So if nobody cares, then you kind of create a spectacle, and that's where often the violence associated with social protest is, that you end up, destroying some property, doing something which would get the attention of the authorities, would get the attention of the media. So Gandhi was very, against it. He thought that it undermined your goal. And to understand that, we all have read in history books that how Gandhi, during his first mass movement that he had mobilized in 1921, he just pulled that movement back. He stopped the movement in between, mass movement in between. Why? Because there was a police station set on fire. the Chauri Chaura incident. And he said, no, we cannot carry on this movement. Yes, the Chauri Chaura incident got the movement national attention. It was all over in the papers. The British rulers started focusing on what Gandhi tried to do. And Gandhi at that time withdrew the movement, and all his followers were very upset on Gandhi. They said, why has he withdrawn the movement when we were succeeding? We were getting the attention of the British. Shahid Amin, a historian, has very eloquently discussed this episode, although I have some differences with the way he has interpreted it, but he has in a book on Chauri Chaura as a metaphor. But the core idea is saying that why Gandhi withdrew it. Because, and he said, he believed that if you are going to use violence, then most probably you are undermining your own cause. And that is, that tells you a lot about Gandhi. That tells you that how, and what he was doing was, he had a theory that how action should be engaged, political action should be engaged. And then this incident happened, violence happened, he withdrew it. Now people could have thought that, okay, he has made a mistake and going forward, the Indian freedom struggle would falter and eventually nothing will, it will not succeed. But then that strengthened his movement. That strengthened his idea of nonviolence. Because then after that, when the salt Satyagraha took place, despite all the violence from the police and the authorities all over the country where people were trying to break the draconian salt law, nobody engaged in violence. And we had the same protest even in very small places, in small towns, in small villages, people gathered and did the protest non-violently. So that was Gandhi. It's almost like Gandhi predicted that if you could do things you can do things without non-violence, and it turned out to be. Gandhi was right. So that is the context in which I would like you to focus on that, see that, that is one of the goals. And so there are two goals in a social struggle. One is to be first heard and seen. That means if you are speaking, if you're organizing a protest, you should be able to be seen. The authorities should be able to see and hear your voices, and other people should be able to hear your voices. And the other is that you should be able to persuade the authorities and people who disagree with. Now that is a much more bigger challenge. And that is where Gandhi's real innovation comes in. And there are similarities about his innovation with other theoreticians, but in case of other theoreticians, it's mostly theory. In Gandhi, we see praxis. So that is where you will find the relevance. So what Gandhi did was that he said that two conceptual ideas were important to his theorizing of political action. And one of them was Satyagraha, and the other was Ahimsa. Now, often we know these two terms independently. We know what Satyagraha is. Satyagraha is insisting on truth, and Ahimsa is non-violence. But like in any theorization, how these two concepts are, how are they interrelated? How they have a symbiotic relationship, the two of them. And that is what drives the Gandhian theory of action. So the first part about the notion of Satyagraha, that means insisting on truth. That means you're carrying a movement and you're insisting on truth. In this, Gandhi was a very reflexive person. To say you are insisting on truth, it doesn't mean that you know the truth with full certainty. All that you know is that all the evidence I have and all the internal thinking I have done, I think this is the truth. I think that this is the right path. But I could be wrong. Now that's a social scientist speaking. There's you could be wrong. There is a likelihood that this is true. And he was thinking in terms of that this is true, likely true, and so that's why I am compelled to act. I should come and protest, or I should organize a show, I should voice my opinion and speak about it, but with humility. Because even if there is a small chance, or if I'm interpreting my opponents incorrectly, he wanted to leave that little scope, and that is where Ahimsa comes in. Why should you not engage in violence? Not only that violence is just, eventually undermines your persuasive capacity to persuade others, but at the same time, violence is also not to be practiced because you could be wrong in interpreting the intentions of your opponents. Now that is how he brings them together, between Satyagraha and Ahimsa. Without understanding that relationship, we won't be able to really appreciate Gandhian praxis of political action. And so we need to think in those terms when we think of Gandhi, that how he was, why he was bringing these two ideas together, Satyagraha and Ahimsa. And that is also in a sense that, the whole notion of Gandhi as a that only existed. Other writers, other thinkers who talk them. And that is another aspect of Gandhi's thinking that led to this notion where he said, his struggle is not against the English people, it is against colonialism. And that is at the center of it. He knew he was a very astute, he had a very astute understanding of history. He didn't think that suddenly British came and occupied India. He said there is a logic in history, how this came about, and how India came under the British rule. He was also aware of the fact that there were a lot of British people and English people who wanted to do good, who wanted to help, make India better. It was not that all of them were just out there to conduct one Jallianwala Bagh incident after the other Jallianwala Bagh incident. So it is in that context that Gandhi was saying that we can insist on our truth, but we need to be ahimsak as well in the process. Our goal is to persuade. And so from that point of view, if we look at Gandhi in today's context, we see all these uprisings happening around the world. There is a lot of social oppression. There are a lot of oppressive social hierarchies. They exist in India at this moment. We know we haven't yet solved the problem of social hierarchy and oppression vis-a-vis Dalits, the people in the caste hierarchy at the lower level. We haven't been able to address the oppression served by minorities in India. So we have this issue of oppression still existing. And so there is going to be movement out there. There are people going to come on the street to demand justice. But at the same time, if they're going to follow the Gandhian method, there are two primary things that they will have to keep in mind. One is that there is a legal legitimacy of the state, whether it's in India or, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement over here in US. If you work it from a Gandhian point of view, you would say there is legal legitimacy of the state, there is a law of the land, and that needs to be is there. And we think some parts of it is unjust, and we are protesting on those parts which are unjust. But if the protest becomes challenging the very legitimacy of the state and questioning the intentions of the people acting behind, enforcing the laws of the state, then we are, from a Gandhian point of view, we would be going beyond our, we would not be true to ourselves. How do I know that what is the intention of the other person? How can I get into somebody else's head? All that I know is the action, what's happening, and if whatever is happening is unjust, we should address it. And we should voice our opinion. We need to come out in the open and say it. And also we need to organize social protest if people are not paying attention, to draw people's attention to it, that is being seen and heard in the corridors of power. But at the same time, we have to persuade, right? And you cannot persuade somebody who you think is a demon. So for example, there is often cited that Gandhi had recruited for soldiers for the First World War. Now one would wonder, Gandhi was a non-violent person. He had this absolute idea of nonviolence. Why would he do that? That is where you have to understand Gandhi much more closely. And this is my reading of Gandhi is this, that there are some people who are beyond persuasion, and there is enough evidence to suggest that they are beyond persuasion. Their hearts cannot be changed. Their minds cannot be changed. In that kind of a situation, if they are going to use force, you have to come forward and defend using force. And that is the basis for what Gandhi did during the First World War. Even during the Second World War, I don't think Gandhi would have said, hey, let's go and fast in front of Hitler. He knew that the overwhelming evidence was this, that Hitler was beyond persuasion, beyond, redemption in a sense. That he couldn't be persuaded or the Nazi regime. He was pure evil. In that kind of a situation, you had to fight. There is no option but to fight and to use force to bring down a fascist regime, and that was or a Nazi regime. So that's where you have to understand that it was not that Gandhi was a pacifist in all conditions. He had his, and this again tells you how Gandhi was. It is his social scientific understanding of the world. There are no absolutes. His Satyagraha is not absolute. Ahimsa is not absolute. Everything is a variance. Sometimes your opponent could be really so far ahead in violence that there is no other way but to control it through means of war. So technically he supported two major world wars, World War I and World War II. And so that is so if we coming back to this idea that, I want to dissuade people that, if you think that Gandhi was this, he would have, people sometimes say, somebody had said that, I remember it was somebody, when I was to me that, the Chinese soldiers are on the border of India. I remember in social media, somebody put out a meme, Chinese soldiers are on the border. Oh, he was trying to make fun of Gandhi and saying, okay, go ahead and hold a fast in front of them. Now that is the misunderstanding of Gandhi. Like, you don't really understand who Gandhi is and how he conceptualized his political action. That's a naive reading of Gandhi. So coming back to this idea that how from these two concepts, Satyagraha and Ahimsa, he brings it together in to develop this idea, dual goals of social protest and social struggle: to be heard and seen. That means your voice should be heard in the corridors of power. And second, to be able to persuade your. So if you look at that, what is the underlying principle behind it, or the underlying process? And this is where I would like to also, remind us that politics is not a thing. Politics is a process. And Gandhi understood it very well. And in this underlying process of politics, what is that process? It's a process of social interaction. It is a process of communication. At the heart of it, it's all about social interaction and communication, because that is how you would be able to distribute power with social justice, or give somebody the authority to exercise power on behalf of everybody, which in democracy happens. You elect a leader and that leader exercises power on behalf of. The whole process is basically communicative. And that is where we have to think of Gandhi's political action as a communicative action. That particular communicative action is somewhere you see some parallels with a great thinker of modernity, Johan Habermas. Habermas, who came up with this, he's very well known for his idea of public sphere, but his larger theory around it is known as the theory of communicative action. And you can see that, and it is primarily one of the most dominant hermeneutic approaches in political communication. Habermas is very influential in that area, and you could see that Gandhi was, in a way, sense, preceding what Habermas was saying. He was talking about communicative action before Habermas. And if we compare the two, we will see that both Gandhi and Habermas have theorized it in terms of an ideal speech situation. So Habermas's term, ideal speech situation, and what Habermas was talking about, that a genuine communicative action which can foster social change can happen if an ideal speech situation exists. And what did he mean by that ideal speech situation? He was thinking about it in terms of that there should be a space where everybody, despite class hierarchy, despite social differences, can come together and speak and discuss things openly and freely. And that is what he called the public sphere. In addition to that, he also thought that all the participants in this discourse, in this public discourse, he recognized that all of them have rational capacity or the ability to acknowledge a reasoned argument. If somebody presents a reasoned argument, they are ready to change their mind. If there is and by reasoned argument means using logic and also evidence. So if you present an evidence and if you present logic and make a reasoned argument, somebody should be able to, your opponent should be able to agree with you. And that is the ideal speech situation in which Habermas was working. Although he himself said it's an ideal. That means it doesn't always exist, or it's very difficult to achieve. And so in Gandhi's concept, Gandhi's Satyagraha and Ahimsa would have never succeeded if he didn't himself think in this kind of situation that he could persuade the British. The British could realize the injustices, that the injustices of the colonialism. British rulers could realize that, they need to set India free. And that is a great belief in the conscience of your oppressor, that the oppressor has conscience. At the same time, you're also assuming that oppressor has not only has reason, has capacities to reason, and it has capacity to recognize evidence presented in front of them. Now that is at the heart of what Gandhian thinking is. And there is that similarity with Habermas in terms of that this kind of action is only possible if you assume an ideal speech situation. However, the difference, as you can notice, between Habermas and Gandhi is that Habermas relied too much on the capacity of an individual's human's rational capacity. That means to reason. If you present evidence, they can follow the logic and sequence, whereas Gandhi relied more on moral conscience. Because Gandhi thought one thing, that moral conscience is one thing which is equally present in everybody despite education differences. You could have educational differences, but somebody could be illiterate and somebody could be highly educated, but moral conscience exists in both of them because we are endowed with it. We as humans are endowed with moral conscience. We can suspend it for a moment. We might not want to think about it, but if somebody nudges us in that direction, our moral conscience will get awakened. Whereas Habermas relied more on rational capacity, in which there could be differences between if people are trained in rational thinking or people are trained in education can make a difference over there. And so in Gandhi's situation, it was the conscience that he was trying to say. That is, in an ideal speech situation, he's relying on the conscience of his opponents. And he wants to appeal to that conscience. So, for example, I'll tell you, this is a good point to actually think about an anecdote that I will tell you, which is connected to Uttarakhand, and it's very relevant here, is about Sundarlal Bahuguna. Sundarlal Bahuguna is an environmental activist, and he was one of the biggest opponents of large dams in Himalayas, mega dams, and he thought that it will bring a lot of destruction in the long term, ecological destruction. And many of you who are very young may not know it, but we all had seen him, how single-handedly he was sitting in protest at the entrance of the old Tehri town for months, for years, opposing the building of the dam. And many people would say that, why is he doing that? Nobody's listening to him. Nobody cares what he's doing, And in 1995, I, with a colleague of mine, Himahuja, I went to was doing a feature assignment on Tehri Dam and the consequences of controversies surrounding it. And so we decided to go and see him. So we went to the old Tehri town and we wanted to interview him. He was not there. We stayed there for a day and then eventually got to talk to him. And one of the things that came in my mind was, I asked him, just imagine you are here 20 years from now at this very spot. There is no Tehri town. It has already submerged in this grand lake that is built. And the entire area is surrounded by big fluorescent lights. There is a huge dam generating a lot of power. And you see all this. And what would you say about your protest that you're engaging in now? Would you reflect, in hindsight, how would you look at it? And he paused for a moment and he knew what I was trying to say. I think he knew, understood it very well. He's a Gandhian. So he said, this is the truth I know at this moment. The truth is this, that this large dam is ecologically destructive. And I am doing my karma. If I know this truth, I cannot sit home. I need to come and express that truth. And that is what I'm doing. Even if I'm alone, even if I'm the only person who is doing it. So he is sitting in front of that bridge. If people who are older might remember that bridge crossing over into old Tehri town. And just next to that bridge, he had set up his kutia, his small hut. And you could see him, anybody could walk and talk to him, anybody who would listen, right? And he had and you could have long discussions with him. And he was saying, this is the truth I know, that the dam is ecologically destructive. So I cannot sit home. And then he reminded how the lesson he learned from Sridev Suman. So Sridev Suman was this freedom fighter who died in the prisons of Tehri Raja after undertaking a fast. He was a leader of the Prajalanda Mandal movement. And he said, this is the lesson he gave me. If you know this is the truth, you have to stand by it. Not because in future something might turn up, but keep in mind what happened. And if all of you who are scientists, who are geologists, who are other people who are development engineers, you should think about it, that because of his protest, the dam's design changed over a period of time. It became more safer than what it was initially. Even though he was not an advocate of rehabilitation because he thought it was undermining his own process, the rehabilitation became better because of the protest of people who were rehabilitated from Old Town. So that protest produced tangible results. And the dam became better. He pointed out that how the dam could break under an earthquake of Richter scale 6, of 5.5 to 6, and then the design was redone so it was stable for up to 7.5. So the thing is that he knew that is the truth, and that's what Gandhi's the linking of the two ideas. Satyagraha, that is your truth, that is the truth, all the evidence you have, and you are going to insist on it. You might seem adamant, you might seem to be alone sometimes, so you do that. And in the process, what are you appealing to? You're appealing to the moral conscience of the other side. You're presenting evidence, you're insisting on something, at the same time you're making the other side see that there could be something in it. And so that is the process through which, I don't know, Sundar Bhaguna is very old now, if you recall this conversation with me, but that is and I did talk about this conversation in the article, which I published in 1995. So that is the basis of Gandhian thinking. That is the Gandhian political action. What happens is this: we say political action and we think of no, Sundarlal Bahuguna was a social activist and environmental activist. But remember, politics pervades everything. Because what is politics essentially? It is about, as I said, who gets to exercise power, how power is distributed. And is there social justice in it, in the process? So that was an incident which really made me think about Gandhi. It was actually Sundarlal Bahuguna. That conversation with Sundarlal Bahuguna really made me start thinking, and that's almost now more than 2 decades back. I'm still thinking about it, that what was Gandhi's real. So we need to focus on that part of Gandhi. We need to understand his political action. We have too many statues for him. We have too many, we worship him as a saint. I think more than that, yes, people are perfectly okay to worship him as a saint, but it's more important to think of him as a theorist who was not just a theorist, but a theorist who was also a practicing politician. So he was a political theorist as well as a practicing politician. So in a sense, his ideas were much more relevant than somebody like me who is just a theoretician or just an academic. You see, he was putting it to practice himself. He had a skin in the game, as they would say. He would theorize, but he had a skin in the game. He was going to practice this also. And so he knew the flaws, he would understand it, he would tweak it like all science. Science is always tweaking your arguments in light of new evidence. And so that's what he was doing all the time. And that is also the lesson of my experiments with truth, which was his first biographical book, where he was tweaking his own understanding about truth. So Gandhi, more than civil disobedience, his lesson is more about this political action and this integration of Satyagraha and Ahimsa. And how do you integrate it in the idea of politics? And this appeal to moral conscience as an essential criteria of ideal speech situation. Now, this is where I'd like to, and we can see that not only in Sundarlal Bahuguna, we saw that in Chandi Prasad, but these are real people who really understood Gandhi people. You can see in their own action. They were practicing political action based on Gandhian thinking. You can see it in Indramani, you could see that in Indramani Baduni, who led the Uttarakhand movement. That he understood what it meant, He was not an advocate of let's go and organize a hartal and burn things down and push things up. He was a great advocate of peaceful protest. At the same time, he was a great advocate of respecting the police, because they are enforcing a legitimate authority. He was not questioning the legitimacy of the state, but just because the state cannot be, what was being opposed was something that the protesters, he thought was unfair treatment of the mountains of Uttarakhand, of Garhwal and Kumaon. And so that's what he was protesting on. He was not protesting the challenging. So this is the nature of people who really practiced Gandhi, often in terms of their politics. We have very few, today, nature of politics has changed. Here I want to take a little bit on a side note, this from Habermas to another great thinker from Europe who also understood Gandhi much more closely, is Johan Galton. He's a Norwegian philosopher, and he's one of the pioneers who started peace studies. In that arena, you go back to thinking about politics as speech and persuasion. Politics is primarily about speech and persuasion. It's communicative action. Now, much of our politics today, it is much easier to understand why politics is communicative action, because much of the politics is practiced through media. We have mediatized politics. Politics is practiced on a digital platforms. Politics is everybody, so we are seeing how communication is central to politics. And that is where I think Johan Galton's understanding brings, his interpretation of Gandhi and his application of Gandhi in an international communication context that he had started is relevant. So Galton was, he studied international flow of communication. And by international flow of communication, he meant basically news and information, how it travels across the world. And how this news that travels from across the world is structurally disposed in favor of violence. And by doing that, it just fosters more violence. And that's why there is less peace around the world. And in that, he tried to define it as, he came up with this new concept called peace journalism. And what was the idea was that he said, we need to re-evaluate the whole structure of news values. What makes news? Because the way the news values are structured, it promotes violence. It's structural violence. And so we need to rethink about news values. In a broader sense, this notion of peace journalism, I and a colleague of mine, we have advanced it in terms of peace communication. That it's not just journalism, but all forms of communication. Because on digital media, we are having interpersonal communication, we are having group communication, we are having journalism as well. So all that is happening, and how that communication has to be, in a way, we have to rethink it, that whether it's structurally disposed to violence. And what this reminds me of what Professor Anup Kumar in her opening statement talked about: speech as violence, communication as violence. In that sense, you can see that if you are watching the nightly television debates every night, what are you seeing actually? You're seeing communication violence in practice. So if our politics is today more mediated, much of the 90% of our politics is taking place through media, whether social media or legacy media. And if that legacy and social media is structurally disposed to violence, then our politics is violent. And that is where things need to change. So we need a new updated theory of political action in a mediated environment. How do we re-emphasize Satyagraha and Ahimsa and the links between these two concepts? How do we articulate it in a way to come up with a theory of communication on digital platforms, in the media, in a way that it promotes peace, or promotes what we can call an ideal speech situation? Again, remember, it's an ideal, we will never achieve it, but we can move closer to it. So that is the basis. If you look at how the coverage of protests take place today on the media, and how other political issues every day that arise and how they are talked about in the media, and not only the we individuals, when we post stories and tweet, how are we promoting non-violent speech? So if our world is going to become more and more virtual, if everything, our interaction, as politics is the basis of interaction, so if we are going to interact through mediated tools, then it's important to understand that whether those mediated tools are going to be structurally disposed against violence or not. And that is where Galton's idea of peace journalism or peace communication comes into picture. And you have to think about it that, how do we define what is peace communication? So there are two ideas in Gandhi's thinking, which is important to understand that. One is obviously Satyagraha and Ahimsa were two concepts which he brought together in his theory of action. But at the same time, there are two other ideas, which is human dignity and the shared human condition. That means there is human dignity, everybody has human dignity has to be recognized, and there is a shared human condition. And once we recognize those two ideas and we bring them together in our everyday speech, then it can make a difference in how we would be able to see Gandhi's relevance. And that is, if you look at Gandhi's people who are some international followers of Gandhi, if you look at Nelson Mandela and if you look at Martin Luther King Jr., what did you see in them? What did they see? Perhaps more than we Indians, they understood Gandhi much better. Because they knew his political action, how Satyagraha and Ahimsa were tied to it. And they also knew how not to demonize the opponent. That is why when Nelson Mandela was released, he comes up with Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and he says, it is not about that we have been able to dismantle apartheid. Now let's get after all the white population and throw them out in the sea. Because it was about persuasion, we are able to persuade them, we are able to awakened their moral conscience, made them see the human dignity of the Black population of South Africa and other colored populations. And this is a moment of change. Now we are all, our human condition is same, whether white or black. Same was with Martin Luther King. He was opposing the policies of Jim Crow South, but he wasn't opposing white population. That's not what his point was. His point was primarily about that, we need to awaken their conscience to the injustices. And once we awaken the conscience, the moral conscience is same in all of us, things will change. So that is the basis. Now, if we look at, from these ideas, if we look at what's happening now in the world and all these movements that are taking place, I'd like to briefly talk about two. One, Uttarakhand movement, because I studied it very closely. And the other, I want to briefly touch upon the Black Lives Matter movement. And then maybe if time permits, to Shaheen Bagh protest. So if you look at the Uttarakhand movement, perhaps in the modern history of India, was the first subnational movement which was not violent, which was entirely carried out following Gandhian principles. Now, when I side of the protesters, that the movement activists, yes, violence took place because there was violence from the state. And sometimes violence was created as well, just to delegitimize the movement. And why was that? Because if you see it, it was led by somebody who really understood, Gandhi much better than many of us, which was Indramani Barduni. He really knew it. And a lot of other social activists who took part in the movement, who had gone back to other smaller movements, going back to the forest movements, to the Chipko Andolan, and they also had the legacy of Dhandaks. If you go back and look at Dhandak, there is something about Gandhian strategy in Dhandak itself. The Dhandaks was not about engaging and trying to break things down or doing something. What was the prime principal strategy? To be heard and seen. Let's gather and be heard and seen by the king. Let the king see us and his moral conscience will awaken. That was the primary goal. But it doesn't mean that there aren't other people who are going to disrupt that process. They know that if the king so there's an interesting, in my research I found that some of the organizers of Dhandak said, well, the king doesn't know exactly what's happening to us. If he comes to know, he'll change. So if you look at all the Dhandaks in Uttarakhand, they are based on this notion that you have to. So it's like an escalatory ladder. Petition, write letters, gather and protest, and appear and get seen, and eventually people will change. You remember that meme that goes around, supposedly attributed to Gandhi. First they will ridicule you, then they will finally, they will change, and then finally change will happen. I don't know if Gandhi ever said that, but you could see that process, that it is part of the social process of Gandhi. And that is what is, so in Uttarakhand movement, we see that. This movement was able to achieve statehood without any armed rebellion. Look at all the statehood movements around the world, in India. You would find that, so this is the lesson of Uttarakhand movement. We generally don't really pay too much attention to the significance of Uttarakhand movement from that point of view. Now the other is coming to the two new movements going on, one in India and one in US. In the US, there is this movement, Black Lives Matter, and there is, in India, there was a movement called Shaheen Bagh. Now, or it's still going on. The protest is not happening, but it's a movement. It's a movement at the level of ideas. So what do you see in these movements? There is a truth that the people who are advocating this movement, they believe it is true. Now, how would these movements become Gandhian? They will become Gandhian with two attributes, if you look at Gandhian approach. One, they'll insist on truth, but they will also know that this truth might not be certain. They should not be certain about it. There has to be humility in that truth. That you could be wrong. You could be wrong about intentions of the opponent. You could be wrong about the policy's full implication. There is possibility. But this is what you perceive at this moment. This is your perception. Like, for example, in Black Lives Matter, not every police encounter with the blacks is, every police officer is not racist. So that is the humility in the truth. Yes, there are some of them, and especially with George Floyd, the act of killing of George Floyd was very evident that it was, it moved people, because you could see that 9-10 minute video, and you could see that Floyd was not being treated as a human. There was lack of human dignity to him, was denied. And so both these movements in the Shaheen Bagh protest, where there is perception that this government is against Muslims, this government is passing laws which are discriminatory to Muslims. Now that's my perception, and this is a perception of us. And that's why we think this is true, and that's why we are going to insist on it. We're going to come forward and make the government see that why we think like this. Now, but when you do that, you have to realize you could even be wrong. There could be even a little chance that maybe this is not the intention of the government. That's how Gandhi, that's why you should not use Ahimsa. You have to be Ahimsa. Because Gandhi would have permitted violence only in case of things which is really, there is very clear evidence that everybody on the other side is violent. Like, for example, when he advocated war against the Nazis and fascists in Germany. He knew they are beyond redemption, he knew they are wrong. So that is the basis. And then the other side is the legitimacy of the state. So Gandhi's practice was within the legitimacy of the state. He was not, he accepted the legitimacy of the British state. So when they punished him, sent him to jail, he went to jail. He said, I think these laws are wrong. I will go to the jail. He didn't say, no, you don't have a right to prosecute me. In a sense, Gandhi is talking about a long legacy of, you might have, some of you might have read about Socrates, Apology, and then there was another piece in which Socrates, what does Socrates do? He's presented before the Athenian people, and he tries to persuade them, saying that why he should not be condemned, why he's right. He tries to persuade them, he fails, and he's punished with poison. Then he's in jail, and then his friend, who is a rich merchant, he comes and says, I've arranged an escape for you. We can arrange an escape for you. We can take you out of this place. Socrates refuses. He says, no. The Athenian state has followed its law. I failed to persuade them that I was right. And so following the law, I am being condemned to death. So I need to take this punishment. So it's not that I'm going to escape from the prison. Is the basis, and the legitimacy of the rule of law is recognized. But at the same time, you are also recognizing injustice, because injustice happens, and you are coming out in the open and protesting about it. You're speaking.
I think there is some technical problem of from the side of Professor Anup Kumar.
So this is not from our side?
No, ma'am. I think we should wait for some time.
Yeah, we can wait 1 or 2 minutes and we can hand over to Professor Purohit meanwhile.
Yes, ma'am.
Let him join once again.
By the time he joins back, could I read out the questions which have been addressed to him?
Please.
First question is from Dr. N.K. Sharam. Says Gandhiji has said that religion cannot be separated from politics. How would you analyze this statement, particularly in the present scenario? This is his question. The second question has come from Professor D.P. Saklani from HND Garhwal University. He says Gandhiji used symbols in politics, especially his deep attachment to Rama and Ramarajya, despite the fact that this category was not powerful. His oratory was not powerful, but what was that in him that made him a mass leader? This is from Professor Saklani. And one research scholar, Dr. Anup Kumar, has asked a question. He's asked a question regarding the student politics, student union, and their indulgence in physical violence, arsoning, etc., etc. This is his question. And the third question comes from Vivek Nathani. Vivek Nathani is also a research scholar in HNBGU. His question is, do you think that there is a contradiction between Gandhi's philosophy of legitimacy of colonial state and principle of self-determination? These are all the questions which I found on the chat. And I think when Professor Anup Kumar is back.
Yeah, I'm sorry. For some reason, I don't know how the Zoom got disconnected.
It happens. It happens.
Yeah, so that is the reality of the the virtual setting, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So in your absence, I think Professor Purohit read out some questions,
Okay.
which were for you to reply. So Professor Purohit.
Yeah. So I would just like to conclude that.
Yes,
I'd like to conclude with this one statement that we need to, especially in universities, in the academic settings, we need to start focusing on Gandhi as a political theorist more than just Gandhi as a moral saint or Gandhi as a politician. Yes,
Sure.
that's important, but Gandhi can change the nature of politics if we really focus on his ideas, his theoretical ideas on how politics should be practiced. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Now,
Yes,
now you have already read the question, so you have to read it once again.
Yeah. First, I would like to thank Professor Anup Kumar.
Yes.
I think after seeing Attenborough's Gandhi, this is the second time that I have been able to comprehend Gandhian theories and Gandhian practices. Thank you, Professor Anup Kumar. So this is, you have raised beautiful issues on his theories like legitimacy and the political justice and law of the land and the social protests, and you have analyzed Ambedkar, Loya, Sundarlal Bahuguna, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, and many others in the light of Gandhian theories. And this was very interesting that you presented Gandhi as a theorist and a political activist, and this is his philosophy of social justice. And we were enlightened by you on the views of on this beautiful anecdote about Sundarlal Bahuguna when you were sitting in his Ganga Kutir at Terry. And you, I think few of us have very rarely pondered over the political action and the political theory of Hindumani Baduni, which prevented the Uttarakhand movement from becoming violent and a terrorist movement. It was verging at terrorism at one point of time. Thank you so much, sir. And there are questions for you. One is from Professor N.K. Sharam. He says, religion cannot be separated. Gandhiji said that religion cannot be separated from politics. How do you analyze this statement in the present scenario?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Thank you, Dr. Sharan. So this is in the context that when he says religion, what Gandhi is meaning is not institutionalized religion. You know, religion has two different facets to it. One is the institutional process, and the other is religion as spirituality. And that is where all religions share a lot of similarities when it comes to spirituality. And what is the spirituality that Gandhi is talking about? Which is, I think Gandhi is talking about the moral conscience of, so when he says Ram Rajya, what is he talking about? He's talking about the moral conscience of Ram. But at the same time, he's also talking about Ram's recognition of the rule of law. Not that you should not oppose unjust laws. You should oppose unjust laws because that is insisting on truth. And so he said that, you know, in his idea, to practice political action in an ideal speech sort of a situation where you are able to persuade others, you have to recognize that the others have moral conscience, the others have faith as well, not only you, you know, and that is the basis on which if you try to persuade them, if you do the, you know, if you protest, if you fast, if you organize sit-ins, if you organize dharnas, eventually they will see your point of view. They will recognize the injustice you're trying to draw attention to, because that's the faith. Now, when he said that, you know, if people who do not have faith, spiritual in a spiritual sense, they are unpersuadable from his point of view. Because remember, he's not thinking in terms of just, so if somebody would have said, would Gandhi have decided to go and do a fast unto death in front of Hitler? And Hitler would have changed his views. No. Why? Because Gandhi knew Hitler had no spiritual conscience. You know, there was no moral conscience. So that was the limitation. His strategy cannot work with people who don't have moral conscience. That's what I think Gandhi meant when politics and religion are inseparable. Because you have to recognize the faith and the moral conscience of other people, not the institutional religion, but more the spiritual side of it, which we call spirituality, which is common among across religions, you know. It is not really different.
Thank you, sir. Second question is from Professor D.P. Saklani. He likes to know your views on Gandhi using symbols in politics, especially his deep attachment to Ram and Ramarajya. Despite the fact that his oratory was not powerful, but what was that in him that made him a mass leader? That is his question.
Yeah, so that is a very important point. One of the things about Gandhi is this, that a lot of people were converted to Gandhi's ideas not because they had heard him speak. They had read him, you know, and they have heard other people who had read him. He used to be, remember, he's also a journalist. He puts together a newspaper. He also is continuing writing he wrote his book, which was published much before he started his political campaign in India, My Experiments with Truth, in Gujarati. Then it was translated in other languages. And so his communication was much like scholars communicate, through writing, right? So he was communicating through his writings. And by the time he came to, in a mass movement, to address thousands and thousands of people in a rally, by then, people were already predisposed to recognize his ideas through this diffusion of his writings, both to the illiterate as well as literate. Literate people read him, illiterate people heard other people read him and tell them about Gandhi. So that's how the entire information spreads in the society. So that's one reason why Gandhi's rhetoric or his capacity to speak, be a very eloquent speaker on the stage, was not that important for, you know. And that is also comes down to, you know, Habermas has a suspicion for persuasion. Why? Because he thinks you can actually deceive through speech as well. And you can persuade using deception. So somebody could be a very good speaker and could use those speaking skills to deceive. The rhetorical skills that the person, and Gandhi was plain speaking, you know, he was the ordinary person. He was not, but one thing about Gandhi was that he knew the logical sequence of ideas. And that came from his training as a lawyer. He knew how ideas connect to one to the other. So even if he spoke, his Hindi was not that great. He was primarily a Gujarati speaker. So, and he spoke very slowly, but people could see the logic in his argument. And that was, speaking about Ram Rajya, Now the symbolism of Ram, as I said, was Gandhi's connection to Ram, and not only Ram, but also there is another word that Gandhi influenced very much, Gita, Bhagavad Gita. So Ram was, in a sense, for him, as I said, rule of law. So Ram goes to Vanvas because rule of law, right? The king has promised that he has to be sent, he goes to. He comes back, and then also he practices rule of law. And often in the process of rule of law, yes, the laws could be unjust. That's not denied. But for that, you have to do penance, you have to protest so that the laws can change. So that's the basic understanding that he had about Ram. This is what I think. And as for the other thing, you can't really understand his notion of Ram without thinking of Gita. Now, a lot of people think about Gita, you know, especially in the West, a lot of scholars have written about it. There's a book of war. Critical scholars who write critical works, they have said that it is a book of war. That's not what Gita is. And the lesson that Gandhi took was entirely different. Gandhi's lesson from Gita was, it is a book of action. You cannot be a pacifist. So before the Mahabharata war, there was an attempt to persuade. There was an attempt to make the other side realize that there was injustice. But when that persuasion didn't succeed, then war became an eventuality. So it was just like you cannot persuade Hitler, you couldn't persuade Duryodhana. And then you can't be just pacifist. You can't say, oh, I'm a non-violent person, so now I'll go back home and sit home because, you know, I can't do anything. There's another episode in Gandhi's life. Somebody asked him that when in Africa, this was in South Africa, when he started his first protest, somebody asked him about that when he was organized his first protest and there was a police action against it, you know, baton charge, lathi charge was taken up. He was beaten. Other protesters were beaten. They said, well, you didn't, okay, you promoted nonviolence. You said you're not going to raise your hand against the police because one, as he said, the police are just implementing the laws of their land at this particular moment. But let's say your son was there and he saw his father being beaten. What do you think your son would have done? He said, my son would most likely have intervened. He would have pushed the police officer who was beating him with a stick. And I think that would have been the right thing to do. That's the lesson of Gita. That's his son's karma. You see, the son's karma was to intervene.
Yes, there are two more questions. One is from a Ph.D. student, Amit Parihar. He says that the students these days are taking the cause to violent protests, sabotaging the property, and indulging in arson. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that is where I think that, you know, so as I said, the protest has two goals. One is to be seen and heard, and another is to persuade. Now, the seen and heard, sometimes people feel frustrated that they're not getting seen and heard. And so, in the process of engaging in violence, they would get seen and heard. Because then people will say, why are they burning down the building? Oh, they are burning down the building because they think these laws are unjust. They are thinking about social oppression. They're talking about this. But the problem is this, that by doing that, what have you done is you have undermined the second step, which is persuading the other side to recognize the injustice. And that is what Gandhi's lesson was, that, you know, if you engage in violence, then you are undermining the second goal. First goal was to be seen and heard, and the second goal was to persuade. Now that goal gets undermined if you use violence. And that is what students should realize, and any protest movement should realize, that why that second part, you know, look at a lot of movements that happened after the collapse of Soviet Union, which are known as the color revolutions. What happened in these movements? These people gathered in the large public square and just sat in. They didn't burn anything. They didn't engage in violence, large-scale violence. They just kept sitting there for months till the government eventually gave in. Same happened with the first phase of the Egyptian revolution. Thousands and thousands of people came and occupied the public space and said, see us, hear us. See us means see the multitude of people who disagree with you and hear us why we disagree with you. And eventually Mubarak resigns. It doesn't mean that, there are other forces also continuously acting. And those forces will push you to violence. Because that's what anybody who has participated in Uttarakhand movement knows that how a peaceful protest would suddenly turn into violence. Somebody throws the stones at the police. Somebody does something. Remember that body protest from when the first violence started. I'm still unable to find who started throwing the stones at the police. These were people were fasting unto death, right? Who orchestrated that violence? And this is what, and in Mussoorie, where these people were protesting and then suddenly it erupts into a violence. Who orchestrated that violence, And that's what happens in a lot of protests. Sometimes it's not the students who are engaged, starting the violence. There are some elements within the students who are interested in the violence. Because remember, as a political ideology, people are persuaded by all kinds of different political ideologies. There is an ideology of social change, which is very, which is strong, powerful, especially among its adherents, which is Marxist, Maoist ideology. Now, it is in favor of social equality. It wants to change oppressive regimes, but it sees relevance of violence as well in it. So it is very easy to, let's say a group of students are protesting. The students come from different political persuasions. And somebody thinks, hey, we should engage in violence, then only people will pay attention to what we are saying.
Yeah, I would also support you, and I would also like to say, because this question is about the university students and their protest. So you are very true that the motive is to be seen and to be noticed. If they are not noticed through peaceful means, then they adopt violent means. And then you are very right to say, when you say that there are different groups and they belong to different ideologies. If one group is doing something, the other group thinks that they have to do something different. And the third group thinks that if we should do, if we will also do the same thing, then how our identity would be recognized. So they adopt altogether a different means. So that's how this violence is also promoted. Yeah. And to preach the students that you have to be non-violent, you have to adopt Ahimsa is very, very difficult, because when they are close-minded, they don't want to listen anything. So this culture needs to be promoted. And this is the task, because you are a professor of communication, and you have explained it very nicely, that the communicative action, so their actions are also communicative. They want to communicate. All of them are saying the same thing, but the means are different. So their means are different. Why? Because they just want to get noticed, and the more notorious they become, the more they'll be noticed more. And they would like to be in the headlines of this group did this thing, that group did that thing, and they'll get more space in the media also.
Yeah.
Media also, they'll be highlighted. So I think this is their impulse. And this impulse promotes them to adopt violent means. And it's very difficult to tell them the lesson of Ahimsa, because when you act in a group, like you said, that who threw the stone in Podi, the same thing happened in Khatima. There were so many instances of violence, because the Uttarakhand movement was largely non-violent. It was non-violent till it became violent. And in Uttarakhand, there are several instances when the non-violent movement took place, like Chipko movement you referred. And it was I think the movement totally based on Satyagraha and totally based on non-violence. And it was women's movement. although it was later on, as I said before also, that it was converted into ecofeminism. It was not, because the women did not know anything about the theory of they did not know. Then people started claiming, no, it was ecofeminism, and writers like Vandana Shiva, etc., and they started to highlight it like that. But the women were just protesting or protecting their rights. They were acting to protect their rights. The same thing happened with the movement Nasha Nahi Rojgar Do. It was afterwards what happened. It is also a history, and it is also a communicative practice. So the question which this student has raised, it's a very valid question, because everybody is witnessing that students or their groups are becoming more and more violent. And as I said in the beginning also, that this violence may not be like hatapai. It is a abusive kind of violence. It all depends on their mode of communication. Very debateful. They like to talk in a very loud language, or they would like to threaten you with their communication skills. So it's a kind of violence which they are practicing these days, and it's very difficult to preach them that they should not adopt this path, because they are all motivated, promoted, and they are they are taught that if they will speak in this kind of language only, then they'll be listened, they'll be noticed. So this is this.
That is the dilemma that protesters have, that if I'm not getting noticed, how do I get noticed? And also
That's
as I said, the news media is structurally disposed as a news value towards violence.
yes.
So
Yes.
violence gets you in the headlines.
Yes.
And so that is where that happens. But the Gandhian strategy is it's about, in terms of, you need persistence, you need patience for it.
Yes, and it was
And you need to build a whole consensus around it. Yeah.
and it was the result of his practice.
Mm.
It was not that it emerged in a day or two. Practice.
Yeah.
It was his long practice.
Yeah. At the end, his primary goal was to convert the minds of the British rulers.
Minds of people. That's true.
And he did. He eventually converted their mind. And that is, he awakened their moral conscience about the negative consequences, the inhumanity of colonialism.
Yes.
Any other question, Professor Purohit?
Yeah. There is one question from Vivek Nathani. He says there is a contradiction in Gandhi's philosophy of legitimacy of colonial state and principle of self-determination.
Yeah, so Gandhi was trained lawyer, right? So he was trained as a lawyer. So as a lawyer, he understood the notion of that within a time sequence, within a time frame, a state can be legitimate. It doesn't mean it is moral. It doesn't mean it's just. It's just that the state. So that means that the state has come into being not through illegitimate means, or is not being existing because of, remember, the British colonial state comes into existence as a transition from Mughal rule to British rule. And that transition takes place slowly in phases, where the British become first the agents of the state, that means of the Mughal ruler. They become just their agents through proper legal documentation and contracts. And then they eventually overtake the state. And the principle, this is fascinating actually, if you ask some historians, and there was a person who wrote something some time back, that how the British saw that taking over the state. That means from the Mughal ruler after 1857, where they tried the Mughal emperor. And what did they do in the trial of the Mughal emperor? They said the Mughal emperor was being tried for mutiny against the state. And the Mughal emperor thought, how can I, the emperor, mutiny against the state? So the Mughal emperor couldn't understand the British thinking. Why? Because they thought that the state is independent of the emperor. Remember, emperor is not the state. And so the emperor can mutiny against the state. And not only that, they had a long history in Britain where they had hanged their own kings. So, which is, they call it the Glorious Revolution of 1688, where they hanged Charles I, right? So the British, for a sense, were recognizing, and that is the nature of the transition. So I'm just trying to point out the context in which political legitimacy or the legal legitimacy of a state exists. So legal legitimacy exists. It doesn't mean it's a moral legitimacy. It doesn't mean it is just, because that's a separate argument. So for example, if like in India, Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, there is Indian legitimacy on the right over Kashmir. That legitimacy comes through legal contracts, legal documents of accession. But that legitimacy does not automatically make the rule just. The rule can become unjust because if it doesn't treat people properly. And it can become, so there is a difference between things being legitimate and things being moral and just. And you can challenge justice. So for Gandhi it was, and that's why, remember India's independence struggle, India's independence came about as a consequence of a legislative law passed by the British Parliament. You see, legally the power was transferred from Mughal to British. The British legally transferred the power to Indians. Okay, that's the whole continuity of legitimacy of Indian state. This Indian state is legitimate going back hundreds of years. That is why the laws, it's not a revolution. It's not the French Revolution, destruction of the state and building of a new state, or the Communist Revolution, destruction of the state and building of a new state. Any law before that doesn't matter. It doesn't exist. And that is another basis for why Indian Constitution is actually a continuity of the Act of 1935, because Act of 1935 was a smaller version of the Constitution. So it becomes a continuity of the state in India. And Gandhi, as a lawyer, understood, could perhaps, I think, make this distinction between, so when he was sent to jail or he was fined, but he said, yeah, you are implementing your law, go ahead, do that. But I think it's unjust, so I will keep protesting.
Okay, there are two more questions. One from Subhash Chandra. He's from the Department of History. He's an assistant professor in HNDGU. He says, do you find a difference between Satyagraha and Dhandak?
I think that there are similarities between Satyagraha and Dhandak, especially in the repertoire, in the nature, the tools and repertoires of the protest. There is a lot of similarity.
Yeah.
There is also a similarity in Dhandak and Satyagraha in a sense that it doesn't start by delegitimizing the state. The state is legitimate still, and it is appealing to the state to change its behavior, persuading the state to change its behavior. And that is the similarity between the two. All those, and that is why the Dhandak people who participated in Dhandaks, there's a very interesting episode about the Ramai Dhandak, in which Tilari, in Tilari Kand. These people who are engaging in Dhandak are saying, obviously within that group there are Marxists, there are communist Marxists, and there are Gandhians, and there are other sorts of groups of people as well. So there are, in that group, there are some of them who were saying, hey, the Raja of Tehri is, if he is Bolanda Badri, that means if he is the voice of God on earth, then he will be able to see the injustice if we just bring it to his attention. The officials of his state are not giving him accurate information. You see? Then what happens is this, that these people come to Tehri and they want an audience with the king. And then they eventually don't get an audience with the king, but they get an audience with the Rajmata. Right? And so there is a sense in which there are some similarities, there are some overlaps, and there are obviously significant differences as well, because the nature of state is different. The nature of the Tehri state is very different. Nature of the state, status of the king of Tehri is, as I said, in much larger population, he is considered Bolanda Badri. But in the colonial state, these are foreign rulers. So there is a very different context around it. But there are similarities and overlaps.
Thank you, sir. That's why all the sins were planted on Chakravartya. There's a last question from Prabhakar Pandey to everyone. His question, he says, Gandhi's principles. He says, can Gandhi's principles be implemented in today's materialistic era? How can one practice this tough philosophy of Gandhiji?
It's a very good point. You know, it's a very good point. It is to be, like somebody said, only a Mahatma can be Gandhian. You know, and if you're not a Mahatma, how could you be Gandhian, right? It is very difficult. But remember, the world was as materialist in the independence struggle time as it is now. Only the amount of material available to us has decreased. You know, our material well-being has grown, but the world was materialist even then. And but there is this idea about notion that, you know, it is a tough philosophy. As Professor Nautiyal was saying it, that, you know, these students, they can't wait, you know, nobody's noticing their voices, so they engage in violence just to attract attention. But it requires a lot of patience. And that is another thing which I found in Sundarlal Bahuguna. And again, I want to point out that Sundarlal Bahuguna did not lose in the Tehri Dam struggle. You see, he was able to make the dam building. His influence on the dam construction is very evident, both in terms of how safe the dam eventually turned out to be built, how much engineering scientific knowledge could be applied to make it better, and how just the rehabilitation could be. So it was, in some sense, work. So he had patience. He was there. He was sitting. You know, nobody's coming and listening to him. Nobody's calling him for a meeting. You know, and it's not like the CEO or the Hydral Minister of Uttar Pradesh says, "Hey, Bahuguna ji, come and let's have a conversation." That was not happening. But still, he was sitting. So it is a tough philosophy. Yes, I agree. It's not that easy to do it. But one part is easy, which is nonviolence. You know, insisting on truth day in, day out, keeping sitting. There is one more question in the chat that I would like to respond to. I'm seeing it here, which is Cheryl DeMello. She's from Cleveland. She asks, Gandhi was influenced by Christianity. And that is a very important point that we often forget. Gandhi was very much influenced by Christianity. And he was by Christianity, not as an institution, as a religious institution, but Jesus Christ as the person, as somebody who he was very much influenced by it. And why was he influenced? What do we see in that? You know, Sermon on the Mount was perhaps very influential in how Gandhi thought about his own ideas. Because in the sermon, you insist on truth, so Satyagraha is there, but you need Ahimsa. Now there is some influence of Jesus Christ in it. What is he trying to say is this, like Jesus Christ said, you know, that you cannot engage in violence. The reason is this, that remember, you need humility. You could be wrong as well in knowing the intention of your opponent.
Sure.
You see, so that is, you cannot just go ahead. If somebody is engaged in violence, you cannot reply in violence instantly, because you don't know what propelled that person to violence, what happened, what's the context. You know, that showing your other cheek. Now, obviously, you cannot take it to an extreme. As I said, there are always examples like Hitler, and in Gita there is Duryodhana. There is a time when you have to fight. There is a time when you have to really fight. So he was, because that is the nature of Gandhi. Gandhi is a politician. He's a practical person. He's a pragmatist as well. You know, he's not a prophet who could have just said that. So so the influence of Sermon on the Mount is very heavy on Gandhi, and you can see that in he's drawing all those inspirations from other places in trying to develop his own theory of action and to challenge colonial rule.
That's great. Citing Sermon on the Mount. One last reference I would like to make about Tehri Dam is Sundarlal Bahuguna is there. There is another Gandhian sitting in Buda Kedar, Lok Vikas Sansthan, Bihari Lalji. Bihari Lalji once said to me, look Purohitji, if Sundarlal Bahuguna was not there sitting on his protest, तेरी दाम जो है बालू और मिट्टी से बन गया होता. We should remember his statement. Bahuguna's statement. Teri Dam would be the material used in Teri Dam would be sand and clay.
Yes.
That was Bahuguna's answer to another Gandhian, Bihari Lal. Thank you so much, sir. I think my part of
That's so accurate. That's so accurate. And that is why we should recognize the contribution of Sundarlal Bahuguna in ensuring that the engineers did make, did fill it with balu and rain. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much, Professor Nautiyal, that you gave me this opportunity to moderate the questions. And thank you, Prasant, and thank you, everybody. And now I give it over to the...
Thank you, everyone.
One moment, Naresh.